I've been a field recordist for 12 years. I capture soundscapes for film, video games, and meditation apps. I've recorded the howl of winds in the Mojave and the crushing silence of snowfall in the Rockies. I don't believe in ghosts. I believe in frequencies. I believe in the physics of sound waves bouncing off matter. But what I captured on my equipment in Idaho 3 weeks ago doesn't follow the laws of physics. It follows the laws of hunger. I was headed to Massacre Rocks State Park in Idaho. If you know the history, the name alone sets a grim tone. It was a choke point on the Oregon Trail, a place of ambush and violence. But I wasn't there for the history. I was there for the Snake River. I needed heavy, churning hydroacoustics, the sound of massive volumes of water moving through basalt canyons. It was late October. The tourist season was dead and buried, and the park was practically empty. The air was biting, hovering just above freezing, and the sky was a flat, bruised purple as the sun went down. I parked my van near a secluded bend of the river, far away from the highway noise. I set up my rig on a jagged outcropping of black rock that jutted out over the water. My gear's top tier, a sound devices mixer and a pair of customized hydrophones, underwater microphones encased in waterproof resin. I lowered the cables into the dark, swirling current, watching the black water swallow the sensors. I put my headphones on. The world above the surface disappeared. The wind, the rustling sagebrush, my own breathing, it all vanished. In my ears, there was only the deep thrumming roar of the river. It sounded like a jet engine slowing down, a heavy, bass-rich drone of water grinding against stone. It was perfect. I adjusted the gain, watching the levels on my small LED screen, entranced by the raw power of the river. I had been recording for about 20 minutes when I saw the spike. On an audio visualizer, sound looks like a wave. A sudden loud noise creates a spike. I saw the spike on my screen before I heard it. It was a sharp, high-frequency transient, cutting through the low drone of the water. A second later, I heard it. I frowned, twisting the knob on my mixer. It sounded like a mechanical failure. Hydrophones are sensitive. Sometimes a loose connection can create a high-pitched whine. I checked the cables. Everything was secure. Then it happened again. Wah, wah. My stomach dropped. The sound was distinct. It wasn't a mechanical whine. It wasn't the squeak of rocks grinding together. It was organic. It sounded unmistakably like the cry of an infant, but it was distorted, as if passing through a dense medium. I took the headphones off, looking around the darkening riverbank. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded thin and pathetic against the wind. Silence, just the rushing water and the wind hissing through the dry grass. There was no one for miles. No cars, no hikers, no lost families. I put the headphones back on, feeling a prickle of irritation. It had to be a beaver or an otter. Animals make strange noises, and underwater acoustics can warp a squeak into a scream. I hit the mark button on my recorder to tag the spot and kept listening. The river drone continued. I closed my eyes, trying to refocus on the texture of the water. Mama. My eyes snapped open. I ripped the headphones off, stumbling back on the rocks. The cable tugged at my waist. That wasn't a cry. That was a word. It was garbled, bubbly, and wet, but the cadence was human. I stood there, heart hammering against my ribs, staring at the black surface of the Snake River. The water looked like oil, thick and impenetrable. I'm a rational guy. I immediately began to rationalize. Radio interference. Sometimes long cables can act as antennas and pick up AM radio signals. I was probably picking up some talk show or a drama broadcast from a station in Pocatello. That had to be it. I sat back down, shivering, though I told myself it was just the cold. I put the headphones back on, determined to prove it was just interference. The soundscape had changed. The heavy, relaxing drone of the river was pushed into the background. The foreground was now occupied by a chaotic, wet, fluttering sound. It sounded like 100 tiny hands slapping the surface of the water. And then the giggling started. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was stereo. It was panning left to right, swirling around my head. It sounded like a nursery, but wrong. The pitch was too high. The giggles were too sharp, lacking the warmth of a human child. They sounded mocking. I looked at the water. It was pitch black now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. But about 20 feet out, where my hydrophone cable disappeared into the depths, I saw something. A ripple. Not a ripple caused by the current, which flowed downstream. This ripple was moving upstream. I squinted. A small, pale object broke the surface. It was about the size of a football. It bobbed for a second, then sank. Then another bobbed surface to the left, then two more to the right. They looked like driftwood, bleached white driftwood, but driftwood doesn't swim against the current of the Snake River. I reached for the cable to pull my mics in. I wanted to leave. I didn't care about the recording anymore. But as I tugged on the line, it went taut. It was snagged. I pulled harder. It didn't budge. Then, through the headphones I was still wearing, a voice whispered, crystal clear and freezing cold, right into my ear. "Come in. The water is warm."
The voice didn't sound like it came through the microphone. It sounded like someone was standing right behind me, whispering directly into my auditory canal. I spun around, swinging my flashlight beam wildly across the sagebrush. Nothing. Just the empty, rocky slope leading up to my van. I turned back to the river, my breath coming in short, panicked clouds. The line was still tight. I yanked on it again, desperation setting in. These hydrophones cost $2,000. I wasn't just going to cut them loose because I was spooked. "Let go," I muttered, planting my feet on the slippery basalt. I pulled with both hands. Slowly, heavily, the cable began to come up. It felt like I was dragging a dead weight or a tangled branch. I watched the water where the cable entered, my flashlight beam trembling on the surface. The giggling in the headphones stopped abruptly. It was replaced by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was the sound of inhaling, a wet, rattling gasp, like a drowning lung trying to fill with air. I couldn't take the headphones off. It was like a car crash. I was paralyzed by the horror of the audio. As the end of the cable neared the surface, the water around it began to churn. Not violently, but with a disturbing, deliberate coordination. The pale shapes I had seen earlier were back. There were dozens of them now. They clustered around the line, just below the surface. In the beam of my light, they looked like white, bloated fish. But as one breached the surface, I saw it wasn't a fish. It was a hand. It was small, pale, and wrinkled, like a prune. The fingers were long, too long, and between them stretched a translucent fleshy webbing. It slapped the water, splashing playfully. Then a face broke the surface. I stopped pulling. I stopped breathing. It was the size of a human infant's head. It was bald, the skin the color of curdled milk. But the eyes, there were no whites. They were solid obsidian black, reflecting my flashlight beam with a dull, predatory sheen. And the mouth was wrong. It didn't have lips. It was just a slit that opened to reveal rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth, like a deep-sea viperfish. It smiled at me. I remembered the story then. The local legend I had laughed off at the gas station in American Falls. The Shoshone legends of the water babies. During times of great famine, mothers were forced to drown their infants in the river rather than watch them starve. The spirits of those children didn't leave. They adapted. They changed. They grew gills and fins, and their hunger shifted from milk to meat. They mimicked the sounds of crying babies to lure sympathetic travelers to the water's edge. I wasn't looking at a spirit. I was looking at a predator that had evolved in the dark for hundreds of years. The creature holding my cable hissed. It wasn't a baby's cry anymore. It was a reptile's warning. Through the headphones, the sound was deafening. It was a cacophony of screeches and wet thuds. Play with us. Feed us. Mother, father, meat. The words were jumbled, a mix of mimicry and intent. They were learning. They were testing which sounds triggered a response. I grabbed the cable, intending to sever it with the knife on my belt, but before I could reach for the blade, the line jerked. It wasn't a snag. They pulled. The force was incredible. I weighed 200 pounds, but I was yanked forward off my center of gravity. My boots skidded on the slippery basalt. I fell to my knees, scraping them raw, sliding toward the black edge. I screamed, dropping the cable, but the loop of the excess water had tangled around my ankle. I scrambled backward, clawing at the jagged rocks, my fingernails tearing. The headphones were ripped from my head, flying into the darkness. I didn't need them anymore. I could hear them with my own ears now. A chorus of wailing, 1,000 crying babies distorted by water and malice rising from the river. Wah, wah. It was deafening. It vibrated in my chest. I kicked wildly with my right leg, trying to free my left ankle from the cable. I was 3 feet from the water. 2 feet. A wet, clammy hand clamped around the heel of my boot, then another. They were swarming the bank. They moved with a terrifying, scuttling agility. They didn't crawl like babies. They moved like spiders, their limbs splayed out, wet skin slapping against the rock. I shined my light down. There were at least 20 of them. Bloated bellies, webbed claws, black eyes. They were climbing over each other, a pile of wet, pale meat, fighting to get a hold of me. I kicked one in the face. It felt like kicking a bag of wet clay. The creature shrieked, a sound that shattered the night air and bit into the sole of my boot. I could hear the teeth crunching against the rubber. I was sliding in. My waist was over the edge. The freezing spray of the Snake River hit my face. I reached for my belt. My fingers, numb with terror, fumbled for the knife. "Help me! Daddy, help me!" The voice came from the one biting my boot. It looked up at me, releasing the rubber for a split second to speak. Its voice was perfect. It sounded exactly like my niece. It sounded like family. For a microsecond, my brain stalled. The biological imperative to protect a child warred against the survival instinct. That hesitation almost cost me my life. 3 more latched onto my leg. I felt their weight dragging me down. My other foot slipped into the water. The cold was shocking, instant pain. Under the surface, I felt dozens of tiny hands grabbing my calf, their nails digging through my jeans. I screamed, a primal roar, and ripped the knife from its sheath. I slashed at the cable wrapped around my ankle. The blade was sharp, but the wire was reinforced with Kevlar. It didn't cut clean. I hacked at it again. Shunk. The creatures were climbing up my body now. One was on my thigh. Its skin was freezing, coated in a thick, foul-smelling slime. I could smell its breath, rotting fish and stagnant mud. It opened its jaws, lunging for my femoral artery. I slammed the pommel of my knife into its skull. It crunched with a sickening, wet pop. The creature fell back, screeching, but 2 more took its place. I slashed the cable a 3rd time, putting every ounce of adrenaline I had into the strike. Snap! The tension released instantly. I kicked backward, scrambling up the rocks on my back, flailing like a crab. The creature shrieked in unison, a sound of pure frustration and rage. It wasn't a cry anymore. It was a sonic weapon. My ears popped. I didn't look back. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted. I left the mixer. I left the headphones. I left $2,000 of gear on that rock. I ran through the sagebrush, tripping over roots, my lungs burning in the freezing air. I could hear them behind me, the wet slapping of their bodies against the stone. They were fast, but they were amphibious. They were clumsy on the dry, uneven ground. I reached the van and fumbled for my keys. I dropped them. "No, no, no," I sobbed, dropping to my knees in the dirt. Behind me, the sound of slapping grew closer. Come back! Play!" I found the keys. I scrambled into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as a heavy, wet weight thudded against the metal panel. I locked the doors. I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. I threw the headlights on. They were there, standing in a semicircle around the front of the van, a dozen of them. In the bright halogen beams, they looked even worse. Their skin was translucent in places, showing dark veins pulsing underneath. Some of them had limbs that were too long or twisted. They stood upright, balancing on their webbed feet, staring at me with those dead, black eyes. One of them,
The largest one, standing in the center, raised a hand. It pointed at me. Then it opened its mouth and mimicked the sound of my van starting. Vroom, vroom. It giggled. I threw the van into reverse, spinning the tires in the gravel. I spun around and gunned it toward the highway. I didn't stop driving until I reached Boise, 2 hours away. I sat in a brightly lit gas station parking lot until the sun came up, shaking so hard I couldn't hold a cup of coffee. I never went back to the Snake River. I never went back to Idaho. I told the park rangers I was attacked by a cougar. They looked at the bite marks on my boots, the tiny needle-like punctures, and they didn't say anything. They just gave me a look that said, "You're lucky to be alive," and closed the report. They knew. The locals always know. But here is the part that keeps me awake at night, the part that makes me wish I had never pursued a career in audio. My recorder, it has a backup feature. It records to an internal SD card as well as the external drive. I didn't leave the recorder on the rock. It was strapped to my chest in my field bag. In my panic, I had forgotten I was wearing the bag. I brought the recording home. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to listen to it. When I finally did, I analyzed the waveform. The sounds of the attack are there, the splashing, the screaming, the tearing of the cable. But the hydrophones were still recording underwater for a few seconds after I cut the line, before they sank to the bottom and the signal died. As the microphones sank into the deep, dark channel of the river, they picked up a low-frequency rumble. It was below the range of human hearing, but my software pitched it up. It wasn't the babies. It was something else, something massive, something deep in the riverbed that the babies were swimming towards. The babies weren't the predators. They were the bait. The sound that massive thing made wasn't a growl. It was a word, a single, booming word that shook the silt on the river bottom. More. I destroyed the SD card. I sold my gear. I live in Arizona now. The desert is dry. There is no water here. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the canyons at night, I hear a giggle, and I remember the cold, wet grip of a hand that should not exist. If you are ever in Idaho, near the Snake River, and you hear a baby crying in the reeds, don't investigate, don't look, and for the love of God, don't listen. Because once you hear them, they know you're listening, and they know exactly what you sound like when you scream.